Well, first of all, thank you for organizing this. I know it's probably complicated to do this virtually, but it's a nice setting. And I'm happy to contribute to this workshop by sharing some of the recent work on what I think of as the resilience of networks against not only one type of perturbation, but both. So part of this work is funded by the Simons Foundation and partially by the Army Research Office. So I would start by introducing, I don't think this audience needs this introduction, but just to share why I'm interested in synchronization. The big reason is it appears a lot in a diverse set of applications and real-world examples, including biology, engineering, where you have a bridge that you want to avoid disaster synchronization. It's important to understand what causes them. In power grids, obviously, you want the things, generators to synchronize. And in the brain, there are certain diseases that are associated with essentially excessive synchronization in certain parts. Again, example that we want to avoid synchronization. What makes the system synchronized? It's been a lot of research about that. What I want to talk about is for the same system or maybe slightly different systems. I mean, look at it, it may appear the same, but the synchronization outcome can be very different depending on not only one factor. There has been some recent work trying to understand how, for the same system, different initial conditions might lead to different outcomes. So there is to multi-stability and basing of attraction based on synchronization. For slightly different systems, you can imagine for the same initial condition, the parameters might be different in such a way that causes desynchronization and whatnot. So those are the topics I want to explore. So the effects of perturbations, not only structural but also dynamical. To investigate this question, I'm going to focus on this very simple model class. So it consists of identical oscillators, coupling is diffusive, it couples through a network, which is encoded as this adjacency matrix, tells you whether given oscillator I receives signals from oscillator J, which influence its dynamics. Then the model has this scalar coupling strength. So under this model, you can define a synchronization manifold, which is essentially given by the condition that all the states of oscillators are the same. And I'll show that even within this very simple setup, very complicated things can occur and interesting phenomena can emerge. So I'm interested, as I said, in perturbations. And perturbations can be of different types. I mean, I think most people who study dynamical systems think about dynamical perturbations. These are the ones that affect directly the state of the nodes in the network. But you can also imagine in physical settings when you run an experiment or when you have biological systems that communicate through either chemical, electrical, or other signals or channels, the coupling itself might change. Not only the strength of coupling, but also the weight of the edges might also change, which can also be thought of as a perturbation. So in this work, I call those structural perturbations. And so how do we deal with those? So I mean, it turns out a lot of the existing work on understanding perturbation focus on, I mean, either one of those two axes, which I'm plotting here. On the horizontal, it represents the magnitude of this dynamical perturbation. When that is small, we can linearize the system. Right? Given a dynamical system, whether defined on a network or other settings, you can always do the linear stability analysis, which tells you whether a very small infinitesimal initial perturbation grows or decays in time. When the dynamical perturbation becomes larger, it still remains an open problem how to properly analyze the property. In extreme cases, when the system is globally stable, if it happens to be globally stable, then the hope is that someone might be able to find a Lyapunov function or energy function that allows you to prove that no matter what perturbation, dynamical perturbation you put, it will go back or recover into its attractor. In between, there has been some recent work trying to numerically verify or numerically measure the basing stability, which is a scalar measure of how likely a network goes to synchronization from an arbitrary initial condition in the phase space. It's mostly numerical work. Then on the vertical axis, surprisingly little work has been done understanding how the structural perturbations affect the system's synchronous behavior. An exception is the so-called master stability analysis, which I will review in the next slide. That framework allows you to consider a very small initial dynamical perturbation, but now you can do that analysis not only for one fixed system, but across a whole family of networks and coupling strings. So that's nice. So my talk would focus on identical synchronization. I have to admit there's actually a lot of room. I think I'm going backwards. There's a lot of room for other types of base points. You can imagine if you start with phase oscillators, then you'll be interested in phase synchronization. If you have time delays, and you can start with a state that's a chimeral state where there are partial synchronization together with incoherent state. And all these questions, I think, have not been answered. So there's a lot of room and lots of unsolved problems. I'm going to attempting to do some of these here. So I'll start by reviewing this master stability analysis. Many of you might already be familiar with that. I just want to remind that the basic assumption for this analysis to work are two. One is the perturbation has to be small. Otherwise, you cannot linearize. Assuming that's small, then you essentially can tailor expand those functions f and h based on a synchronous state. And then the second assumption, which always usually goes unnoticed, is that the Laplacian matrix has to be diagonalizable. It's this condition that allows you to decouple the variations or the error modes into those independent equations from which you recognize they have the same form. Then we can define a master stability equation, and then consequently a function that tells you for a particular given effective coupling strength scaled by one of the Laplacian eigenvalues, whether that error mode is going to, again, decay or grow in time. It's about stability. Now, using that function, then one can then define the so-called stability region in the parameter space. So for a given model F and the coupling function H, you can compute the master stability function in the for parameters in the complex plane. That would then give you a region being defined by having the negative master stability functions. Now, for a given network, if it happens that the scaled eigenvalues are all within this region, then the synchronization would be stable. If not, it will be unstable. So then the next question would, to ask is, if I give you two networks, here I'm actually showing you two examples, one that has eigenvalues that spread out, the other has identical eigenvalues, which one is better? And it turns out that you can quantify that by defining the set of coupling strengths that admit stable synchronization. Basically, you ask what are the possible coupling strengths that the network can use in order for the spread out points to all be contained in the stability region, right? So for undirected networks whose stability region is an interval, we can calculate that set explicitly, which also gives an interval. And for that reason, this ratio of lambda to lambda n is often called the network synchronizability for undirected networks. So for directed networks, the story is a bit complicated because the eigenvalues may be complex. So in one of the papers by Takashi and Adiusa, I'm showing next slide, they propose to define the spread, or essentially the variation of the non-trivial Laplacian eigenvalues as a way to quantify synchronizability, not only for undirected, but also in general for directed and weighted networks. I mean, the idea is if the eigenvalues are spreading out too much, then it's very hard for you to turn the coupling strength to synchronize the network. So having said that, so a question then is, if a number of nodes and a number of edges are being given, can someone optimize this spread of eigenvalues? Can we make it as small as possible? Because the smaller it is, then the more flexible one can choose the coupling strength to synchronize the network. It turns out that you can, and you can prove that in this paper, as I mentioned by Takashi and Adiusa, you can prove that there are class of networks who can reach the minimum possible eigenvalue spread, which is zero, because the variation cannot be negative. And those networks have this structural characteristic that the number of directed edges has to be an integer multiple of n minus 1, so number of nodes minus 1. In that condition, you can have the so-called optimal networks. If this condition is being violated, then the network necessarily would have an eigenvalue spread that's that's bigger than 0. So that was a very nice result. In a follow-up paper, we actually, through numerical exhaustive search, listed all the possible optimal networks of 4 nodes. So here in this table, I'm actually showing you as a function of the number of edges, the different networks. I'm not focusing on the suboptimal, I'm focusing on optimal ones. These are the ones that have been shaded by this light orange color. And they occur at n equal to 3, 6, 9, and 12. So I'm going to actually go explain the column in one of the next slides. But for now, just know that, there are a few optimal networks. And they may not be obvious. If you look at n equal to 6, it may not be obvious why those networks happen to be optimal. So one of the follow-up work I was involved in was about are those optimal networks, do they behave the same, right? Do they share similar or the same synchronization properties? So in this paper, collaborators of ours, Raj Roy and Thomas Murphy, their lab, actually set up an experiment using optical electronic oscillators to investigate this question of whether optimal networks are the same or not when it comes to synchronization. The experimental setup is actually slightly different from the simple model I gave. In this setup, the networks actually include delay. So it's not exactly the same as the setup and the conditions under which the optimal networks are being derived. So it's nice to be able to see whether under slightly violated conditions these networks remain optimal. So, the finding was actually interesting. So on the left column, what you see is that optimal networks actually have faster convergence to synchronization compared to the optimal ones. So these are saw in those values in this curve, n equal to 3, 6, 9, and 12, comparing to the non-optimal ones. And what's interesting is on the right side, what you see is that for the same optimal networks, they have the same number of nodes, links, and the same set of eigenvalues. They can behave very differently. So the blue curve in both the panels on the right show that the directed star, which is an optimal network of 3 links, 4 nodes, reach synchronization way faster than a linear chain, for example, even though they are both optimal in terms of structure and they have essentially the same structural characteristics. But why is that, right? So the next natural question is, can we somehow quantify that? In that paper, the way we quantify it was through looking at the degeneracy of the eigenspace, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. So the networks that synchronize faster, we call them non-sensitive, and the slower, we call them sensitive. So, it turns out that mathematically, you can, for a matrix that's not necessarily diagonalizable, you can always do the Jordan decomposition. So you can translate or convert the Laplacian into a Jordan form, and it is the largest Jordan block that you can use to define the so-called sensitivity index. Prakash actually is going to give a talk on perhaps on this topic tomorrow. I'm going to just say a word on what I'm doing here, which is on this for optimal networks. A lot of them are sensitive, and this is because of the eigenvalue perturbation. For a sensitive network, the perturbation scales as epsilon, which is the size of the perturbation, to a fractal fraction exponent 1 over beta. When beta is bigger than 0, which is the size of the largest Jordan block, then this divergence of change is very, very fast. Then a friend of mine recently did some follow-up work trying to investigate this in simple models like Russell oscillators, finding that some of the very sensitive networks actually may not synchronize at all. So here I'm showing as a function of the sensitivity index the time it takes to synchronize. When S is very big, so very sensitive networks, some of them may not even synchronize, given the same initial condition, which is very close to the identical. So that was interesting. And to explain why, I think I have to go through fast. We actually looked at the so-called pseudospectra of those networks. The reason look at pseudospectra is it turns out that the transient behavior is not captured by the eigenvalues, but instead the eigenvalues of perturbed matrices. So using that machinery, we are now able to define a quantity called the structural spectral resilience of networks, which is a structural measure of how resilient a network is, not only for optimal networks, but also for general networks showing you how flexible the network can synchronize. And then what's interesting is this structural resilience seems to have some relation to do with the dynamical resilience. So this is one of my last slides showing you that if you look at the sort of the local basing of synchronization around the synchronization manifold, it seems to have a positive nonlinear correlation with the structural resilience, which we currently don't have an explanation, but we are working on that. We think there might be some interesting duality between structural and the dynamical resilience of networks. So this is my last slide. I'm done. Thank you.